Alright, welcome to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Bycer, and we have a great cast lined up tonight. My guest is the developer behind Dusk. He is a part of New Blood and is working on a lot of projects, and he has certainly a lot to say about kind of the design of the game as well as what we're seeing more with shooters from the indie market. So please welcome to the cast this week, David Szymanski. How are you doing?
Oh, I am doing well.
It is great to have you on. I remember like a year or so ago, I interviewed Dave Oshry, of course, from New Blood as well. And I think you were unfortunately under the weather at the time, so we couldn't have you on. Like, we can't get both Daves on, unfortunately. We can't get the times right.
Some people think that, some people have the theory that we're the same person, just playing different characters, so that would support that theory, I guess.
And I can see the chat is starting to fill up. And for those of you joining us as well, if you're interested or if you have any questions for David about Dusk or whatever, feel free to get them in. But yeah, this is one that I've been excited about because I'm a big fan of Dusk, and especially about what we've seen kind of coming from the independent space in terms of retro shooters, Medieval, Gloomhaven, and so many other titles I want to get your thoughts on as well. But let's see what we have here.
Someone asked Dusk 2 when,
yeah,
of course.
Of course, I knew that was going to be a
Someday,
question.
probably, maybe.
Do you have any answers for that one?
Oh, just someday. Yeah, it's not something that I want to dive into immediately. I mean, I guess it's not immediately anymore. But the quick and dirty answer is just that there's a lot more. Well, there's a lot more cooks in the kitchen than just me now. Doing a Dusk 2 would have to be a full New Blood project. It couldn't just be me doing it. And also, like, I kind of used up a lot of my ideas on Dusk. So, and I don't want to just go into a sequel and kind of like half-ass it. So someday there will probably be a Dusk 2.
I can't tell if I'm Josh, and I can't tell if that is straight or that's a pun from me as well. Alright, but before we start talking more about Dusk, and I'm sure we'll be getting a lot more questions as well, for people watching us right now, either live or recorded, who aren't familiar, could you talk a little bit about your background and a little bit more about who you are?
Yeah, so I live in Pennsylvania in the middle of nowhere. I have a degree in music composition, although I didn't finish that. So my degree isn't in anything to do with games. Before making games, I tuned pianos and worked at Dollar General. I don't want to go back there ever. So I've been making games since I was... I can't even remember how old. I usually say about 12. I think I started before that, but I wasn't really able to pursue it as a hobby kind of in earnest until I was about like 12 years old and smart enough to kind of code games. I actually got into game development because of Myst. I was like obsessed with Myst at the time. And one day it just sort of hit me that, like, hey, I could make something like this. They made Myst in a program called HyperCard. And in school, we were learning how to use Hyper Studio, which was sort of a more advanced version of that. And both of those are essentially just a digital presentation software, kind of like PowerPoint. A little bit better for making games, obviously, because no one's made a game in PowerPoint. But it just sort of hit me, oh, hey, I could do something like this. And so I did, and it absolutely sucked. But that's what got me started in, thinking not just like, oh, I like games, I can play them, but also like, I have the ability to make these. And then I got into programming in Microsoft QBasic, made a few simple games in that, kind of took some time off. Then in college, I think it was about in college where I learned about Game Maker, and so I made a few things in Game Maker, and then from that ended up moving on to Unity, which is when I made my first horror game, which was Fingerbones, and that's the first thing I made that like anybody played. Basically, I'd released other stuff before that, but it was basically like a, friends and maybe a few people on yoyogames.com played it or whatever. Fingerbones was like comparatively huge. Like a bunch of Let's Players played it, Markiplier played it. It was free, so I didn't make any money off of it. But since I'm Szymanski and I come from a long line of small business owners, my first thought was, well, now I should make a game for money so I can make money off of it. And so I immediately pivoted into making another game, and that was the Moonsliver, which you can still, well, you can buy Fingerbones. You can download Fingerbones on Steam also. But you can still buy the Moonsliver on Steam if you were so inclined. And that I originally released on itch, and after a little while, it ended up getting greenlit. And that's basically how my career started. The Moonsliver did well enough that at that point I felt comfortable quitting my job at Dollar General and just subsisting basically on piano tuning and game development, which I did for a year or two. I made another game after that called The Music Machine, which was much better than the Moonsliver, or much better production like value and stuff than the Moonsliver, but did not do as well. And because it didn't do as well, it of course made less money. So that was a bit of a shock, because I'd assumed since it was bigger, I was charging more, that it would make more money. It did not. So then I immediately rushed into doing a fourth horror game called A Wolf in Autumn, which was heavily flawed in no small part because I was rushing it to get another game out to continue, getting income, and also because at that point I was getting kind of burnt out doing horror games. And it didn't do as well either. All of these games did well enough that there was still a trickle of income that, between that and piano tuning and my wife's job, was still supporting us at the lifestyle we were living at that point, which was pretty cheap. So I decided that I was burnout. I'm going to take a break and just mess around with prototypes. And excuse me. So I did that for a little while. Started on a few prototypes, and eventually one day I was like, just for some reason, it struck me as it would be really cool to just model a low poly Quake style shotgun and put it on a first person controller just to see what it looked like. At this point, there was no retro FPS, renaissance or revival. The closest thing we had was like there was Rack. There was the Rise of the Triad remake, and Strafe had had a Kickstarter. Strafe had not come out yet, so those were like the only ones that were you could kind of say were kind of retro. So, I wasn't even necessarily thinking like, oh, I'll get in on this on doing, because there wasn't anything to get in on, but modeled the low poly shotgun, put it on and just started adding to it. Like then it's like, oh, let's animate it shooting. Let's make it so you can punt boxes around with the shots, stuff like that. And at very early on, I wasn't even sure it was going to be a retro shooter. I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll make this sort of a shooty horror game. And then it quickly became apparent it was going to be a retro shooter, because of course it was. And then I was like, since I was 15 years old and I played Chasm the Rift and Quake and Doom and Duke Nukem 3D and all of these games for the first time, I had this burning desire to make something like that. And this was back in like 2004. This isn't when they were current. This wasn't when they were even like in vogue retro. This is like when those were just old games that like everyone was busy playing, Half-Life 2 and Halo 2 and stuff like that. But I really wanted to make something that looked and played like Quake. And when I was 15, and I had drawn up all these design documents for a game called Dusk. And so then, fast forwarding ahead, I have this little Quake prototype. I'm like, I'm gonna finally make Dusk. It's gonna look completely different. There's not gonna, but I'm finally gonna do that. And that's how Dusk got started. Essentially, I worked on that for a while on my own. I ended up sending a really rough prototype to Dave Oshry, who at that time I only knew as the guy who had been involved with the Rise of the Triad remake, which I actually really liked, even though it's incredibly janky. That's a running theme with games that I like. Often they're incredibly janky. So I ended up sending a prototype to him. He loved it. I didn't believe that he loved it and was like, oh, well, obviously this guy's trying to scam me. So I grilled him about that, decided it was in earnest, and that's how Dusk happened as a New Blood game. So that's the long answer to my background.
All right. Oh, it's great to hear that you're from Pennsylvania. I'm out of New Jersey. It's always good when we have like East Coast people.
Yeah,
and it's also
why much of Dusk has that rural Pennsylvania feel, because a lot of it is literally just textures or references from my house, basically around my house.
All right, definitely a lot of questions, and especially we have more from chat as well. Let's see. Let's get to a few of the chat questions.
Sure. One about level design process.
Yeah, I'm trying to see which one came. Okay, the first one was from Thomas. They asked, what was the hardest technical challenge that Dusk had?
Light maps, has also been the hardest technical challenge for Gloomwood, but in a very different way. With Dusk, there was you know what? I should back up. Light maps and multiplayer. For me personally, it was light maps. For the development as a whole, multiplayer. There was a sort of game halting issue with light maps for a while that ended up being just a dumb floating point thing. That was my fault. But it sort of put production on hold for, I don't know, it wasn't even that long. It was just really stressful because that was when I think New Blood was involved at that point. I think. If it was either New Blood was not involved or it was early on in the days of Dusk as a New Blood game, which was basically just me making Dusk and Dave being around and talking to his friends. There was no New Blood team or anything. So I had this technical issue, which now, when we have a technical issue, there's several different extremely knowledgeable and extremely skilled programmers at New Blood that we all sit down and figure it out together. At that point, there was none of that. It was me and Google. And Google was not being helpful, so I just had this light map issue that basically was making it so I couldn't continue with the game, and if I didn't fix it, could not ship the game. Because it was making everything look really blotchy and burnt, and that was incredibly stressful to me. That was super stressful week. But then, later on, multiplayer is just dumb. Netcode is netcode is just duct tape, basically. You're just duct taping things, especially Dusk netcode, which is built on top of a single player foundation that was never supposed to support multiplayer. So the entire development of Dusk World, the multiplayer component, which I was only partly involved with. Most of that, by the end, was our lead support programmer guy. And that it was just constant crisis management for it.
All right. Let's see. Next question from Will. They asked, What is your level design process, and how do you avoid reiterating on something to Oblivion?
Um, so starting into Dusk, I'd never done any 3D level design. Kind of. I'd done a few basically Wolfenstein clones in Game Maker. Game Maker, I don't know what it's like now, but at that point it had rudimentary 3D support, and you could make stuff like Wolfenstein 3D in it. I made a little game called Pit, which you can play if you own Dusk. It's in a hidden goodies folder in the Dusk install if you're interested. But other than that, and there was another one called like Down We Go or something. Um, I hadn't done anything in 3D, so I went into Dusk with like zero knowledge of how to design 3D levels. So I didn't know how to do 3D levels. I couldn't really find any good resources for like basics. Maybe were some out there for like on like modding communities or something, but I couldn't really find any. So I ended up kind of going to John Romero stuff, or like tips from back in the day of Doom, with like, you know, John Romero tips for making Doom levels and all this stuff from like the 90s. I ended up kind of going to that and just following all that stuff. So it turns out the way Romero designed Doom levels fit really well with my personality, because he did them, I think he called it through designed, which is basically you start at the beginning of the level, you design the level until the end, and then you iterate on it a bit. That's exactly how I did all of Dusk's levels, with very few exceptions, and that's how I've kind of continued doing levels and whatever I've done, since. I'm busy, sweet. My daughter is hungry. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so basically start at the beginning of the level and then just like stuff, and then you iterate on it and get, you know, other people testing it and polish it up. The way I keep from iterating into Oblivion is, I mean, if anything, I have a problem with the opposite, which is that I want to get stuff pushed out as soon as possible, and usually it takes either a lot of self-control or exterior, you know, someone else like Dave or someone, to keep me from just like doing a rough draft, doing a few edits, and then pushing it out. So yeah, I have the problem with the opposite, which is that I just want to like do a thing and get it out to people and not have to think about it anymore.
All right. And this other question came in. I don't know if this is a real one, but I've been on both you and Dave's Twitter, so I know how you guys, which is a lot of enjoyment for me over there. Like, it helps me out through the day to read what's going on. But Butchamus asks, does Dusk Dude have balls? Would you be able to give any feedback on that?
I mean, you can save in Dusk, so where else would he keep the saved games?
There we go. So, Dusk officially came out in 2018, I believe. How long did you spend working on
it? Let's see. When did I start it? I think I started it at the end of 2015. If I remember correctly. So that long. It was supposed to be a year-long project. When I was just doing it on my own, and I'm actually usually maybe not as much anymore because there's other issues going on now with creative process, but like at least at that point I was very good at hitting my own deadlines. As I just said, like I do stuff and I want to get it out as soon as possible, so usually I would like set a deadline for something and it would be out. So Dusk was going to be a year-long game. Which is a very long dev cycle for me at that point. I didn't realize how long it was going to actually be, but like the prospect of working on just one game for an entire year was crazy after doing like 4 games in 1.5 years or something like that before that. But yeah, and then it turned into like 3 years. Or 4. It was end of 2015, so it was basically 2016 to 2019, I think.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why, like, later on in the cast, I want to talk more about kind of like what we're seeing in terms of like the retro shooter market. And if I had $1 for every time a developer told me that it was only supposed to be a 1-year project, I think I would be good by now in terms of my revenue. Because everyone always says that.
Yeah.
Let me see. Will also asked, they are 5 months away from releasing an FPS. No one has seen it. How would you get any advice for getting noticed by people, I guess, in terms of for someone who doesn't do social media much?
Okay, that's gonna be a tough nut to crack then.
Mm-hmm.
Because honestly, so you're as a solo indie developer right now, your best bet for getting word of mouth is to try and build a community or try to establish yourself in a community.
Mm-hmm.
Not the magic bullet, but that's a good first step. And for a retro throwback, if you're not in the sort of retro Twitter community, you're probably gonna have a harder time getting noticed. I'm not gonna say it's impossible, because like there are innumerable ways to do this. Or I should not innumerable potential ways to do it, I should say. But yeah, I'm not sure. If it were me, I'm not sure exactly how you would do that without having some sort of like Twitter presence. Because you're gonna probably want to build yourself up or start building a community or start having some sort of like community awareness of that game. Alternatively, if you want to just throw it out onto Steam and itch and just see what happens, you can do that and it could work. It's much less likely to work, but it might. Because, the right people could notice it. It could go through the right people's discovery queues and then get... I don't know. But yeah, that would be my advice. It's not a magic bullet. It doesn't mean you're going to sign up for Twitter and that's going to mean your game's going to do well. But I think that would probably be your best bet on where to start.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And yeah, there's certainly a lot more to talk about, especially in terms of like the PR side of things. And maybe we'll get to that later on. But let me see. Any other questions regarding Dusk that came in so far? I think we're caught up for right now.
Someone did mention that my last name is Polish. It is Polish. Yeah, my dad is 100% Polish, but I'm not from Poland.
All right. So, one thing, or a few questions I have for you regarding like Dusk itself in terms of its development. I guess the first one, let's talk a little bit about the feel, because I think this will also lead, or this will be a good segue later on to talk about kind of shooters in general. But one of the things that I find with a lot of the shooters, especially, I've been playing first-person shooters from, the original Doom to today, playing Hedon, Doom Eternal, so on, is like a good feel for the game. And like Dusk certainly has great feel too, especially with the weapons and the sound effects. And what I want to get your thoughts on is like, what would you consider to be like the essential feel or the essential moment to moment that you really want to go for with Dusk, or just what you want to see in shooters in general?
Well, for Dusk, it was the feel of the game was, at least early on, directed kind of by two main pillars. The first one was I wanted it, like, it had to feel as good to move around as it did in Doom. Because I've always thought it was just like the speed and momentum and stuff in Doom is just very fun. So, like, movement-wise, I tried to emulate Doom as much as possible, just with the basics of like how fast do you speed up, how fast do you slow down, stuff like that. And then kind of went from there and tweaked it into its own thing. Dusk is a little more responsive than Doom, a little less it's a bit less fast, a little more snappy, not quite as snappy as Quake. It's a bit of a middle ground. And the second pillar was, it was based on this offhand, I don't know if anyone remembers the Super Best Friends Play YouTube channel. It's defunct now. They all went their separate ways. But I used to listen to their podcast a lot while I was working on stuff as sort of background noise. And there was one comment one of them made, I can't remember who at some point, where someone wrote in asking them what makes a good character action game. I, at that time, knew very little about character actions. Now I know a little bit more about it, but still I'm not, it's not a genre I know that much about. But I remember one of them said something like, if you are in a a gray room with no enemies, you have to still be able to have fun. And that concept stuck with me can I make a game? And now what they were talking about is, I think they were talking about, you'd be able to do all sorts of cool combo-y stuff and things like that. But for me, what stuck to me is the idea of making something where the basic actions are so satisfying that you could be shooting at a wall and still enjoying it. And so that was something I shot for with Dusk in terms of just the movement and the pressing the fire button. And I was shooting in the dark because, again, I'd done some small Wolfenstein FPSs, but a lot of this stuff, first-person weapon animations, sound effects for firing a gun, muzzle flashes, all this stuff, never done it before, so I just experimented with stuff until I found what I thought worked. And in some cases that ended up needing to be changed down the road. In some cases, maybe it should have been changed even more from what it even was. I think the blood's probably a good one. I kept the blood pretty close to Quake blood. It's sort of a combination of Quake blood and Lithtech engine blood. You've got those blood arcs that come off of guys. Maybe I could have made it a little more over the top. People like their Proteus blood, stuff like that. But yeah, that's basically what I was shooting for with Dusk. And so, as far as with all games, what individuals find satisfying varies a lot. It can be really frustrating, especially with weapon sounds. People think that there are objectively meaty feeling gun sounds. There are not. You can show you can have one person listen to a sound effect and have another person listen to the exact same sound effect, and you could have one of those people tell you it's the best gun sound they've ever heard and it's incredibly meaty and powerful, and the other person tell you it sounds like an airsoft gun. It is insane how subjective it can be. And that goes for a lot of game feel too. Some people want a game that is really weighty and that has a lot of heft and to everything. Some people, like me, I want a game that's really responsive. Stuff that I find satisfying is when the game, it feels like there is no differentiation between the actions of the game and the actions that my hands are doing. That's why, with Dusk, there is very little, there are very few animations in Dusk you cannot cancel. All of the weapon drawing animations, those are just animations. You can start firing at any time after you've pressed the actual weapon key, because I like stuff that's really responsive. And really, in Dusk, the only point where I would delay stuff or kind of keep a player input from doing something right at that moment is just when it was if I don't disallow this, it will break the entire game.
I'm also really happy you used the term meaty, because I was actually going to use that to describe, I like the sound effect for the assault rifle or the machine gun myself. That's a really impactful one. And that's one that's controversial, because some people want a more bassy gun sound, which the assault rifle in Dusk is very bassy. Some people parse that as sounding weak, and when they talk about wanting a bassy gun sound, they actually want a lot of treble. They want that pop. It's very confusing and frustrating. Yes. Because you were not going to get a clear answer from anybody.
because everyone had like hears stuff differently apparently.
And here I thought that was going to be the simpler one too.
No, not at all. And then there's other stuff like, something like camera animations. Like for some people, having the camera going like boom, boom, boom every time you fire, they're like, yeah, that feels great. And for other people, it's just like that's just annoying and stupid and doesn't, it's all subjective. It's all a very personal thing, and really the trick to, and someone in chat also brings up the point, like if you, I think a lot of people think that we need to make everything at an 11 for it to feel good. That doesn't work. If you put everything to an 11, you just get jaded to everything.
Yeah.
It's fun for the memes sometimes, for stuff like Russian overkill or, things like that. But if you have like, every single sound in your game, for instance, just being like this heavy impact, trailer noise or something, it's going to get annoying. Or have every gun just, fill the screen with muzzle flash. Yeah, there has to be a context for the more powerful weapons, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and what you said about kind of making like response and what the players doing like as one-to-one as possible. Yeah, and that's something that I agree with as well. That at least in action games, that one of the things that always annoys me, I don't see this too many in the FPSs I play, but I see this a lot in platformers, is that when you jump and the character moves, the character gets carried by its own inertia, even if you're not holding down the controller. And like that just always drives me crazy when I try to play a platformer like that.
Yeah, and that's again why Dusk has literal one-to-one air control. There's no difference between how your character controls in the air and how they control on the ground, which is actually something most retro shooters did not do. People talk about Quake having like insane air control. It doesn't unless you're exploiting it, unless you're bunny hopping. It was not meant to have that. Like if you just normally jump in Quake or Half-Life or anything, you're kind of committed to that direction, which to me never added much. Same thing as like drowning underwater in, Quake. It's like, I mean, it's realistic, but it never added anything, so I just didn't have it in Dusk. Or fall damage. It's like, fall damage in something like Thief, or like an immersive sim, yeah, sure, that makes sense. Fall damage in an action FPS, it's like, never added anything for me. I'm just ripping it out.
I saw the question from Trino. We'll answer that, and then I have a few more questions. We'll get back to talking about more of the gunplay.
You will be surprised by the answer to that question.
Ooh.
Anyway.
So, Trino's question was Event Horizon influential for Dusk? And what other non-gaming media influenced the game's development and design?
Okay, so I have never seen Event Horizon, and I may have seen a picture of that, the sausage grinder quarter, I don't know what you want to call it, that everyone thinks influenced the grinder in Dusk. But it wasn't a direct reference at all. It was just something I thought would be cool. As far as other non-gaming, I think the biggest one for Dusk was, at least for episode 1, was Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is my favorite horror movie. So that's why, the first level is called Head Cheese, which people think is a gross joke. No, that's a Texas Chainsaw Massacre reference, because that was going to be the original title of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. What else? That's sort of the main one. I think so. Jacob's design actually was Dave's idea, and it's based on, this is another movie I haven't seen, but Dave has. It's based on Mads Mikkelsen's look in Doctor Strange. Which at that point in development, honestly, I was just like, sure, I don't care, anything to get this game done and out the door. All we knew is that it has to look like Dave, but it has to look weird and messed up. And so he was like, how about that? I'm like, cool, superhero, I don't care, we'll do it.
There you go. To Will's other question, we'll get to that one in a few minutes, because I think what we're going to be talking about in terms of gunplay and gameplay will kind of segue into that one on its own. To bring this back to kind of the gunplay and feel, what was kind of like your thought process on the weapon design and balance? Because this is like the other side of the coin when it comes to gun feel. I think a maggot. Hopefully, I didn't butcher that too badly. A maggot was talking about the feel of the super shotgun in Quake 2. Like I was just playing Quake in hands last week, and the feel of the original shotgun. Like a sniper rifle shotgun felt amazing in my hands. What kind of like was your approach to the different weapons in Dust? Like, what did you want them to do, and what did you want to like avoid with their designs?
So this is one area where maybe this is again a subjective area. I've always been the guy that I like the workhorse weapons in games more than I like the exotic crazy weapons. Like I'd prefer a good, satisfying assault rifle or a shotgun to some crazy like exotic, like I don't know, the 8-ball launcher in Unreal or things like that. Not that those are bad, it's just that I really like just normal guns that feel fun to fire. So that's why the arsenal in Dusk is pretty much just normal guns, with one magic crossbow and like, the Riveter's basically a rocket launcher. Like they're all very normal, which is something some people were disappointed with, and which I think that makes sense that they'd be disappointed with that. But yeah, so for the Dusk Weapons, it was kind of just me going down a list of, like, the basic archetypes of weapons, weapons I'd want to put in a shooter, because I use them in other shooters. It's like, oh, I want to make my shooter with a shotgun and a super shotgun and stuff. Just kind of going down that list and adding them in and making them as fun to use as I could. So for the shotgun, it was like, well, I want the shotgun to do good damage. I want it to have a spread where it can kill multiple guys at once, like the super shotgun in Doom 2, and I wanted to have a good fire rate and basically just be a really fun shotgun to fire. So that's what I did for that. And with the rocket launcher or the Riveter, it was like, well, I want a rocket launcher, but let's kind of make it a bit crazier and more fun. Let's make it fully automatic, so you don't have that like slow firing annoyance and stuff like that.
Let's see. Yeah, and I'm always of like two minds about it myself. Like for me, I think trumps exotic when it comes to like the FPSs I play. Like if you want to give me some crazy weapon, to think of a Painkiller, for instance. And you have like the buzzsaw launcher weapon, the crossbow grenade launcher, like you can do that. But if it doesn't feel right, then I'm just not going to enjoy it at all. I guess, as kind of a follow-up to that, did you play Doom Eternal? And do you have any thoughts on what they did in terms of, like, they went for every weapon has a very specific role, and you are going to use every single damn weapon if you want any chance at surviving it.
Yeah, I loved that. Because actually, I didn't dislike Doom 2016 at all. I thought it was a good game, but I was not nearly as into Doom 2016 as everyone else was, because it's, in hindsight, now that I look back at it, it's because I was trying to play it like Doom Eternal or like Serious Sam or Painkiller for that matter. And in all of those games, I switch weapons a lot based on the situation. In Doom 2016, doing that would get me killed constantly, and it was really frustrating. And it turned out you're kind of just, supposed to play the game, you pick your favorite weapon, and you just kill everything with that. I didn't like that. So when they specifically changed that in Doom Eternal, and also made the combat a lot more cerebral, and made it so you actually have to think a lot more about how you're moving and the environment and prioritizing enemies and all that, I was over the moon with what they did with that game. But I know that's something some people really dislike. Like I've had people who are like, but I just want to go and blast stuff with the super shotgun. I don't want to have to keep switching weapons. And they're like, well, you're not going to be able to do that in Doom Eternal.
Yeah, and I'm glad you used the term cerebral there, because it's something that I thought a lot about with like Doom Eternal after I played it, that I really did enjoy it as well. I know it can be polarizing. Like for me, I never got into kind of like the high speed like multiplayer side of first person shooters from back in the day or even today. And playing something like that, and of course, a New Blood plug for Ultra Kill, which I'm also really excited about.
Very similar, yeah.
I like that idea that you can't just stand in one spot and shoot. Like, you have to be constantly thinking about movement. I think that could be also why I'm so terrible at like Counter-Strike or Call of Duty, where it's very much, move, and then when you see something you have to stop, get this sight train on and fire. While in Ultra Kill and Doom, it's basically, you stop, you're dead. You can't be standing still in either one of those games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I never really got that much into multiplayer either. Although I have been enjoying revisiting Quake multiplayer now with, some active servers and a server browser. That's been a lot of fun.
Let's see. Oh, Pop Music Killer said, nice Daikatana box in the background.
Yeah, I'm like the #1 Daikatana apologist.
I have not
that's
played
actually, that's a Romero signed Daikatana box, which I basically bullied Dave into giving me, because I just had a normal Daikatana, which is also up there somewhere. And he was like, "Oh, well, mine's signed by Romero." I'm like, "You son of a bitch! I am like the biggest Daikatana fan out there," which is not saying much, but like, and you like, give me that box. It's like, no, I forget why. I forget what there was I think that it's because I I let him ship a bunch of stuff to my house, so he shipped Daikatana along with it.
I did send John an email. I'm hoping to get him on for a podcast someday. Either he's too busy or I'm not famous enough yet for it. We'll see if the two will ever meet in the middle there. But let's see. Yeah, Dread Templar was also good as well. We just finished playing the early acts of that earlier this week. To go back to like the weapon design and such, I guess one thing I want to ask you, like, again, keeping this idea of, workhorse versus, like, the exotic, I guess, how powerful, like, did you want to make the weapons in this game? Because I think this is another thing that we talk about with, like, the feel. Like, there are some games where, your starting pistol is good for 3 seconds. And then the second you get your second weapon, you will never use it again. And then you have games where, again, like going back to like Doom Eternal, Ultra Kill, and of course with Dust, that every weapon retains viability in some way, shape, or form as you play through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, some of it was just giving them each their own strengths and weaknesses. Like, obviously, if there's an enemy, up on a tower over there, you're not going to be shooting him with the shotgun unless you're out of ammo for everything else. Some of it is also that you can take a weapon that maybe isn't that maybe if all the weapons had infinite ammo, you would never use this weapon, but you can turn it into something you use if you're just limiting ammo for other weapons in certain parts of the game. Yeah, I don't ever remember it being that much of a problem that we had to iron out. It just, I don't know. I don't ever remember having to sit down and have discussions about like, oh, let's, we really need to buff the shotgun or things like that because no one's using it. There might have been, we might have had to do that for the mortar, maybe, which is still probably the least useful weapon in the game, although still useful. Especially in the Ratacombs. If you are going through the Ratacombs not using the mortar, you are going to have a very bad day. But yeah, it was. I don't ever remember it being that much of a challenge. It just came about, naturally through we know, this is the long range weapon, so we'll do this. This is the close range weapon, and this is what this ammo cap should probably be because it's more powerful, etc., etc.
All right. Yep, and is tough, I think, to get that balance right. Like I was thinking about when I was playing Quake last week, and Quake is a game that I don't remember playing back in the day, but going to it now, like your rocket launcher can be used almost like predominantly because most of the enemies drop rocket launcher ammo. It just felt so weird to play a game where like one of the strongest weapons you can just use that like 90% of the time.
That changes in the expansions. You need to get used to.
Yeah.
You need to get used to your nail gun in the expansions because boy,
yes.
do they like shamblers.
Oh dear God, yes they do. I guess to build off of talking about gunplay and the weapons, I think that's a good segue talking about the enemies, and then we'll get to Will's question because I think that's how we'll tie it all together. So, what was your approach to enemy design in Dusk? Because as we all know, when it comes to shooters, you have to have good feel, but you also have good enemies to shoot those guns with.
I struggled a bit with enemy design, I think. I approached it from the this changed toward the end of development, where it was just sort of like, well, we've got to add an enemy, just think of a behavior it can do. But especially at the beginning, like, I was kind of making up behaviors that would encourage the player to move and act in different ways. Like, the red mages, or the red grand wizards. I don't know what Dave calls them. I just call them mages. The red mages, they fire the guided fireball. That means that you have to get behind cover, and you also have to keep moving. Cowgirls, they do like a sort of arachnotron attack, where they fire a whole bunch of shots at you. That means you can't backtrack to avoid him. You're gonna have to move side to side. Stuff like that. There's, enemies that fire faster. They're originally, like way back in the original prototype, those were hit scanners. And so they're supposed to serve the role of like, okay, that's probably something I want to prioritize, or I want to get cover between me and them. And then I kind of plugged in, designs for them. Like I think originally the hit scanner, which in the final game is just fast projectile, basic enemy was. Well, they were like a weird mutant, like disfigured corpse thing that just shot you with green energy that was hit scan. And in the final game, those ended up being the goats. And yeah, toward the end of development, it was more just like, let's think of an enemy that fits for, this episode, like the horror, for instance. It's just, let's make a horrible Lovecraftian. Yes, well, it's not really Lovecraftian, but let's make up something that makes sense for an otherworldly evil dimension, and then just like figure out maybe something semi-unique that it could do. Like the horror has a shotgun attack, like the scarecrows, but he's way faster at getting in your face. Or like the flying guys, the bone monks. They have a super, super fast attack, and they also have, they fly, so they're like up vertical, so you have to aim up vertically while dealing with stuff on the ground, and Oh yeah, and the Wendigo. The Wendigo is just a bloodsucker from Stalker ripoff, basically. I designed Mark Diaz, who works at id Software, out of the blue sent me pictures of artwork of Wendigos. I was like, dude, you need to put this in Dusk. And I was like, you are right, those are awesome. So I did the enemy design, and then was like, okay, what does this do that's interesting? I'll just make it a bloodsucker. There's no reason a Wendigo would be invisible, like in actual Wendigo lore, but in Dusk lore, Wendigos are just invisible until you shoot them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why, except that it's fun.
And then you get the jump scare noise when you first reveal them too. Yeah. Let's see. I saw Pop Music's question. We'll come back to that one when we're done talking about the enemies. But Trino said, any enemies got discarded from the game?
Yeah. Nothing really. Nothing really like big. No, nothing that would be missed. But like some designs were originally different. Like the soldier got redesigned, I think, twice. The old ones are basically just other gas mask soldier designs. Like, they weren't that exciting. There was a floating skull enemy that functioned like a lost soul, that just didn't make it in for, I don't even really know. I think it just wasn't that cool. Let's see what else. I think the biggest one is the meme one is called the Meat Lass, which was the very first enemy that was ever in Dusk, and that was back when Dusk was going to be more horror themed, and the enemies were going to be more sort of like abstract, and just weird. And it was this, it was this like humanoid figure made out of meat and bones, basically. That ended up getting cut entirely. Actually, in the code, if you look at code, I think leathernecks are still called the Meat Lass, because they basically got that same behavior, but a completely different model and everything.
Alright. And I guess, like, we were talking about kind of like enemies that have like hit scans versus those that are just projectile based. I guess, what are your thoughts on like those kinds of enemy design? Because we mentioned the Shambler earlier from Quig, and the Shambler is certainly hit scan, and if you're not careful, like that thing will just wreck you, like it did me several times while I was playing it. Any thoughts on like, you know, how you design attacks in first-person shooters?
So hit scanners in shooters serve one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to get you behind cover. In retro shooters, I should say. Of course, once you get to Call of Duty, their only purpose is to damage you until you have to get behind cover, which is kind of the same thing, but sloppier and less cool. But hit scanners are probably the most divisive enemy archetype in shooter games. And it's because if they are done poorly, they just feel completely unfair. And that basically comes down to just how well do they telegraph their attack and how well can you see them. No one really hates the zombie men in Doom because it feels fair. Like, you can kind of see when they're going to attack. They're weak enemies, so you can like see them first and then kill them. On the other hand, everybody hates the cultists in Blood. Now, Blood's a fantastic game, and I think it does ultimately benefit from how punishing it is once you get used to it, but it can feel really unfair a lot of the time because you'll round a corner and they'll immediately shoot you. That doesn't really happen in Doom. What happens is you round a corner, you have a chance to see them and react, and, you know, then they'll shoot at you. And same with Quake, you know, the grunts have like a wind up to their attack, and they also don't do that much damage. But like, I think essentially people are okay with hit scanners specifically if they feel like they have the tools at their disposal to avoid that damage. And those tools are basically getting back behind cover or killing the enemy immediately. I think having attack wind-ups for basically any attack is useful for the player to just be, you know, even stuff that like you can dodge, just having that information that an enemy is about to attack right before they attack is kind of expected. Like, even if a player doesn't notice that that's not there, they're going to feel that's not there. And that's going to, you know, that's going to affect their enjoyment of the combat loop.
So, here's a question, since we already got on the divisive track with Doom Eternal, I have to ask, what are your thoughts on the Marauders design? Because this is another thing that, like, drove people crazy on Twitter and on arguments.
I think the hate surrounding them is really overblown. I think you end up having to do a lot of kind of like mental loops to argue they're objectively bad. They're not objectively bad. If you don't like them, that's completely understandable because they're intended for you to not like them. Like, the entire point of the Marauder is to make you hate them. They are designed to be an annoying enemy that gets you killed. And that's exactly what they are. But I don't think you can really argue they're objectively bad or be like, or even, I don't think you can even argue they're like that different from the other enemies in Doom Eternal, even though that's what the argument people tried to build. And And I think I love that they're in the game. I don't think they're the most fun enemy to fight for sure, but I think they serve their purpose super well, and that purpose is like for them to show up and you to just be like, "Oh, son of a bitch," and yeah, especially getting into the DLC when then they're like, "Ha, you have to fight 2 Marauders at once now."
And then you fight one that's possessed because that was fun, or one was with a buff totem, if I remember.
Yeah, that was very, very fast Marauder.
Yeah, that was fun.
Normally, wait until they're like double speed.
Yes. And I know there's like modders who are like making like Kaizo Doom Eternal maps, and they're like making it even harder. I'm just like, why? Why would you?
I think that's too far for me. I'm not good enough for those sort of things.
Yeah. And I'm just curious, like, what those people think if they fight a V2, an Ultra Kill, because that is a nightmare of a fight, especially if you're playing on the higher difficulties.
Yeah, I think it was a lot of people. Well, first of all, it was a lot of people who wanted sort of turn your brain off and shotgun things, kind of like Doom 2016 was, which, okay, fair enough. If you're going into a sequel to Doom 2016, you would expect it's going to play like Doom 2016. They didn't do that. I'm very glad they didn't do that, but, you know, it's subjective. I think there's a lot of people, and then, you know, the Marauder is very much not Doom 2016. And also is just a frustrating enemy, and you're going to get killed by them a lot at first until you learn how to fight them, and you're going to get frustrated. So a whole bunch of people then took to Twitter and are like, you know, this is ruining the game for me, and are really angry about it, which understandable.
Let's see. Let's get to a pop music's question, and then we'll talk a little bit more, or we'll get to Will's question after that, because that'll be our segue. Pop Music asks, what Unity tools and utilities did you find helpful when developing this? Were there any code bases or structures you recommend when starting a project?
I mean, I don't use many plugins. I do use some, but if you're asking for like about stuff like what is that one, like the FPS tool some people use, or things like that, where it's like big old plugin for making an FPS, I would stay away from those, to be honest. I'm not saying you can't make a good game on the back of one of those things, but you're opening up the door to potentially getting locked into game feel and stuff like that just isn't going to be that great. Let's see. For Unity specifically, you're going to need some sort of level design tool. I think they have ProBuilder built in to Unity now. ProBuilder is what I used for all of Dusk's level design. Now I use a plugin called Real-Time CSG, which I think would have worked much better for parts of Dusk. It's a tool it's not as good for organic geometry. It's far, far better for man-made geometry. It's much more like the actual tools used for making like Quake, or you know, it's even what Quake modders use now. So probably you're gonna want to have, well, like I said, ProBuilder's built in now, so you will have ProBuilder. I personally always suggest to people that you use some CSG tool and use ProBuilder. That's what we're doing for Gloomwood, is we use CSG stuff for man-made structures, and when we need to do a terrain, that's when we have ProBuilder, because you do not want to do terrains with CSG. Other than that, I mean, I'm really not that big on using like a whole bunch of plugins. I think it's like, I do use some, like, you know, sometimes it's really handy, but I think if you start going nuts with like grabbing these gigantic packages and stuff, you're actually kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because you could end up with a game that doesn't play that well, and you don't really know how to modify the black box stuff underneath so it does, and it doesn't run that well, and you don't really know how to fix that, and there could be, you know, errors happening you don't know how to fix. It's just you end up with a much simpler life if you're doing your own code and only relying on other plugins when it's stuff that's like, well, okay, I'm not going to write my own lighting pipeline or things like that.
All right. And I think that's a good point or a good way to talk about this other question from Thomas. Do you think the vertical access unlocked helped in selling Dusk to people?
Oh yeah, 100%. I don't think that it ends up coming into play in the game that much, other than as a gimmick. But like the number of people that have specifically mentioned that shot in the trailer is what sold them on the game. It's I don't even know how many people have mentioned that. It's very common for me to hear people be like, "Yep, well, as soon as I saw you could do flips, that's when I was sold." And actually, I had that shot planned. Like even before I signed with New Blood, like 'cause when I had the vertical flip in, I was like thinking about how I'm like, oh, I know exactly what's gonna be cool. Is if you're seeing like if you see the person go up in the air off a jump pad and you see them firing at something below, and they're like going over, so the view keeps tipping down, and then it just keeps going, and you suddenly realize, oh, they just flipped, and then it would like slam Dusk in at the very end. And so yeah, that shot, like so many people have mentioned that, you know, that's what got them, that's what convinced them to buy the game.
You gotta show at least one like really badass thing in an FPS trailer, I think, these days. But to bring this back to the gameplay, I think this is a good way to also segue into Will's question, to a little bit more about kind of how all this stuff comes together in terms of level design, weapon design, and enemy. To Will's question that he asked earlier, did you find there was a battle between creating atmosphere and good combat design / progression, and how did you marry those two?
I essentially solved the problem by ignoring it. There's fundamentally a battle between, you know, a very creepy, spooky, I guess you'd say even subtle atmosphere, comparatively subtle atmosphere, and backflipping and killing a whole bunch of rednecks with chainsaws. But from the beginning, I knew that was gonna, you know, I make atmospheric games. That's sort of what I'm drawn to. So I knew I wanted to make something have that, you know, that atmospheric creepiness. But I also wanted to make a shooter like Doom. So it wasn't going to be, you know, the moon sliver. You weren't going to be like getting spooked out by shadows. So I thought, at least. And then I made the Wendigo introduction. But you know, from the beginning, I knew it was going to be kind of like these two disparate elements together. And it's sort of in the same way that, you know, Dusk is a very goofy game. It has Big John. Like, Big John isn't even a secret boss. Big John is a progression boss. And it's completely stupid. It is just the stupidest, like, goofiest thing. But then at the same time, there's all this, like, body horror, you know, stuff. All of these discrepancies were present in the games that I was emulating. You know, Doom, people forget that Doom was a horror game when it came out. You know, people rag on Doom 3 for being like, oh, it's too much of a horror game. Doom was a horror game. It was meant as a scary game. Those were the three tenets: was scary, dark, fast. And at that time, it didn't like they didn't see it as a conflict of interest to have a horror game where you're also blasting, you know, 10 enemies at once with a shotgun, and you're also, you know, finding these stupid, goofy, referential secrets and stuff like that. It at that time, it all fit together fine. Same with Quake, same with, you know, any of these games. And so, since I was deliberately making this to harken back to the classics, I was like, well, that discrepancy is part of that. And I think it ends up, I think what makes it end up working is if you don't try to, if you try to undermine it, and you try to be like, oh, I'll try and make these kind of work together, then it starts feeling like, oh, they're just failing at what they're doing. But when you're just like, nope, it's just silly, it's also sometimes scary, but also you're shooting things, and it's just fun. You want to have fun? Cool, and we'll have fun. Everyone's kind of on board with that. And, you know, they're not gonna take the forums and make fun of it for not being scary, the Cuddy Mine ghost not being scary or whatever. They're gonna like go through, ooh, spooky ghost goes past, and they laugh at it and they continue. And then they get to the the Wendigo and they're like, oh, this is actually creepy. That's awesome. And then they continue and shoot stuff, and it's everyone just has fun with it. I think that's something that was really refreshing working on with Dusk, because previous to that I'd been doing a bunch of not just horror games but narrative-driven horror games. Where the whole focus was on like very like subtle narrative, like narrative rooted scary stuff, not really jump scares, and it wasn't really about the fun. And in that setting, you feel like if you don't do everything absolutely perfect to set up this scare or set up these moments and stuff, you are just going to fall flat on your face, and everyone is going to laugh at you. And then you go into Dusk, and it's like, okay, well, if you fall flat on your face and everyone laughs at you, that's great. You succeeded, because your whole point, the whole point here is just everyone to have fun. And what, so that's the long form answer of how I, reconciled those things. Is I just did stuff that I thought was cool and fun, and figured as long as that spirit of it's for fun was through everything, then it would be cohesive.
Yeah, and like the level design, I think as you go through Dusk itself, I think really like embodies, and like the chat song as well, about like 1 minute it's horror, 1 minute it's play for laughs, and it's always weird when we look at kind of like the retro shooter market, even what we're seeing with other indie shooters today in terms of how they approach these levels. Like some, like in Dread Templar, it's all, very dark, very atmospheric, very metal. Then we have, we go back to games like Quake and Doom, like, even though they don't change like the actual aesthetics or, like the actual color palette, you get very different environments. You go from a castle to military bases to some Lovecraftian palace. And it's very tricky, I think, in terms of, how do you set these levels apart from one another? Because I think we were talking about with Doom 2016 that it did start to feel a little bit repetitive near the end when you can just do every room, every level the same way. And to Maggot's comment, yeah, I wasn't a huge fan of Doom 2's level design as well. That's actually a question I wanted to ask you about. Thank you for bringing that up. What are your thoughts on kind of the quote-unquote gimmick levels, where the level is just more focused on, like, let's say a puzzle or something that kind of like dominates everything above all else that you have to do?
Well, if we're talking specifically id Software, almost all of those are going to be Sandy Peterson levels. And there's so little middle ground with Sandy Peterson levels. Either they're like, this is the worst thing I've ever played, or they're like, this is hilarious and awesome. And that varies from individual to individual too. Like, there are people who are like, Quake Episode 4 is peak Quake. That is the best. And there are people that's like, that is the worst part of Quake. I don't think there's anybody who's like, it's fine. So, I mean, I think it depends on the level. So you mentioned Doom 2. I'm one of those rare people you will find who actually really like the Earth levels in Doom 2. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not defending them as like levels that fit nicely into the box of this is how to design a good level, because they really don't. But I think they're fascinating. Like the intersection, the clash, one would say, of one of the most benign, or not benign, the most like pedestrian and normal location probably in any Doom game, which is just Earth, like a city on Earth, a factory on Earth, a suburb on Earth. These are incredibly normal locations. And then probably the least normal of the classic id level designers is doing them. So the most you have like the most extreme end of Doom abstract level design being applied to the most normal locations. I think that's fascinating. I think it's really cool and interesting to go through a Sandy Peterson version of a city, because it's like ludicrous. It's it's Lovecraftian. It literally is Lovecraftian in the sense that like most of Lovecraft is based on the idea that people are looking at something and are unable to comprehend what they're looking at. And that is the Doom 2 city levels. And that is why I love them.
I think that's the perfect summary right there.
They're an abstract sort of hell.
There we go. Let's see. We'll get to Leandro's question, I think, after we're done talking about the level and game design. Let's see. Anything else that came in? Let's see. Trino asks, was the decision of altering the gravity in Homecoming a last-time decision, or was it something that you had in mind for a long time?
Both. The negative parts of both. Doing a game where you could switch gravity is something that I had actively experimented with since as far back as when I was doing QBasic games. This is like in, again, 2005 maybe. I was doing a prototype of something where that must have been around like 2006 or 2007. When did Portal come out? Because I remember Portal was like an influence on it. But anyway, the point is, so the idea of flipping gravity around was something I had always wanted to do. So it was never planned for Dusk, because most of Dusk was not planned. Remember when I talked about through level design?
Mm-hmm.
That was the approach to the episodes also. With very few exceptions, the episodes were designed one level at a time in order. Mm-hmm. There were like maybe one or two that were an exception. The Cathedral in episode 3, that was actually a very early level that was then finished that was started very early on and then finished later on. I think there was one other, but for the most part it was like you started a level, or I started a level, I made the level, we polished the level, we finished the level, and then we moved on. So there are advantages and disadvantages to that. The advantage is that we did well enough in episode 1 that everyone was like, wow, episode 1 is pretty good. And then I'd learned enough in episode 2 that then episode 2 was like way better. And almost everyone was like, holy crap, episode 2, I can't wait for what's planned for episode 3. I didn't have anything planned for episode 3. I felt like I hit the ceiling with episode 2 with you're going through the Escher labs, you're going up into a sky temple made out of metal, and then you're like, so like, how am I gonna do episode 3? And that's when I started digging into the recesses of my imagination for ideas for like, what on earth can I do to top episode 2? And one of those ideas was switching gravity. And I immediately dismissed that idea because the entire Dusk Foundation was built around down being down. Everything in Dusk assumes down is down. The enemies aren't even able to path on anything that isn't ground. And that ground can't flip either. It's a nav mesh. It gets baked in the editor. It is static at runtime. It does not change. So I dismissed that idea until I was talking with my family one Sunday when I was visiting them, and my brother was like, you could do that. Why don't you just flip the character instead of... No, what was it? It was instead of flipping the character, why don't you just flip the entire level around and just use enemies that don't use nav meshes? And I was like, that could actually work. And I was like, okay, I will experiment with this. I will just try it, and if it works, cool, we have another level. If it doesn't work, I won't spend much time on it. And then it was the sort of thing where the initial experiment worked well enough that I couldn't just stop, but not well enough that I could immediately implement it. So then fast forward to like, I don't know, weeks later maybe, I had it kind of working. And it shipped kind of working. The save system, I still don't know if the save system is broken for that level or not. It shouldn't be, because I thought I fixed it, but every once in a while someone comes to the forums and is like, hey, ended up in space. Thankfully it's not game breaking, because, if you fall, you just appear somewhere else. But yeah, that was a decision made, at the moment of designing that level, and then other aspects of the level were kind of informed by that decision to do gravity flipping. Like, can't have any enemies except flying ones, because flying enemies in Dusk use a pseudo Quake style of AI where it's really, really simple. They don't use nav meshes, so they can be flipped around and stuff. Leathernecks and soldiers and mages and all that, they can't. And because you're flipping upside down and everything, I was like, well, it has to be normal locations. Because if you're flipping upside down, like, in some ways, actually, the Quake, the new Quake episode suffers from this a little bit because, I guess, spoilers, but there is a level that flips upside down, or it is upside down, I should say. It's basically a cathedral that's upside down, and it's awesome. It's probably one of the coolest levels in the expansion, or in the episode. It's just that because it's sort of a semi-abstract Gothic Quake cathedral, you don't actually notice until like a little ways in that it's upside down, because it's Quake geometry. You're used to Quake geometry not making any sense. So, I'm like, well, I want it to be real world geometry because it's not gonna really hit you as being cool and weird unless you're seeing that you're like walking up the side of a house or something like this. My ideal vision is someday, I think what would be the coolest is if you're able to like switch gravity in a city. So you could just be like walking on the side of a skyscraper or something like that. But yeah, so then it was like, well, it's episode 3 though. How are we gonna, do houses? I'd already kind of decided on doing the whole looping theme, where you'd start looping back through themes of the previously in the game. So I was like, oh, okay, and then we'll do like floating platforms, because that makes sense with the whole flipping gravity to fly around. Yeah, very iterative, as almost everything in Dusk was. It was like just continuing through a series of micro decisions, based on one another until eventually you have a whole.
And I'm pretty sure, like, for people watching play Dusk, like, that's the level I got like horribly lost into the gravity flipping.
Yeah, and originally, you would. Let me see. Yeah, I think originally you would die actually if you fell too far. Which that was Dave's idea to have you not die. And I was like, that's gonna break the entire level. And then I realized that makes no sense to say. The entire level is breaking the entire level. Like, progression is being broken is part of progression. So we just implemented that loop, the teleport loop, which probably saved it from being people's least favorite of the episode 3 levels. Because boy, if you had like died well, first of all, it probably would be soft locking a lot of people because it's the save system. But yeah.
Thank you, Dave, if you're watching this right now. Yeah, and we got a few questions, but one thing I want to ask you about, because you've been like kind of alluding to it, like how much like things change from episode 1 to 2 to 3, and for people watching us who are like designing levels and thinking about this along those lines, any thoughts regarding kind of like, I guess, that iterative process? Like, how do you like improve in terms of like designing those levels? Because again, when we look at the evolution from episode 1 to episode 3, there's a lot in terms of like what we see in terms of like what the game can do and what you're asking the player to go through. And I think, like, as we've said before, like on like other cats and other talks, it's very tricky, I think, to give levels, like, I guess, like a sense of personality to them, especially in a first-person shooter where most of the time you're just thinking about running through a corridor and whoever's the next enemy you're going to shoot them with or shoot at them.
Yeah. So I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. So do you mean just how do you give a level a sense of personality? Or?
Yeah, and like how do you like, I guess, evolve, or like how did your actual approach to level design evolve as you went from episode 1 to 2 to 3?
Well, first of all, because as I said before, these were, this is like the first time I was actually working in 3D. Those first levels in episode 1 are among the first levels I ever designed in 3D. Well, I mean, I'd done like horror game. It's not the same thing though. Like designing a level for like a narrative horror game is very different from designing an FPS level. So I should say they were among the first FPS levels I'd ever done. The first levels that actually have gameplay going on in them. And so then by the time you get to episode 3, well, I'd done several dozen levels, because there were also a bunch between episode 1 and 2 that I was working on that ended up being cut, or ended up being partially cut, or having parts, reused. So I got better. Like, so, naturally there's a progression there from level 1 to up to level 30. Because by the time I'm, like doing some of the episode 3 levels, I'm better at using Pro Builder. I understand level design better. I understand how to use my own texture set a little bit better and all this stuff. And, so you just naturally get some sense of progression there. But also, like I mentioned, there was this sense that like I had to keep one-upping everything. So in episode 1, I see someone in chat mentioned episode 1 is the most atmospheric. I completely agree with that, and that's because making the levels in episode 1, my focus was a lot narrower. Like I wasn't really thinking of big set piece moments or having the a big overarching idea to the level or anything like that. It was just sort of like I was thinking in terms of like the atmosphere I wanted to communicate, or the setting, the sort of the micro stuff. And then once you get into episode 3, well, with each level I'm thinking of there has to be a big thing that justifies this level existing. And if you'll notice, you get to episode 3, every single level has a gimmick of some sort, like a big gimmick. Sometimes it's a gameplay one, like Homecoming, where you're flipping the level. Sometimes it's sort of a meta one, like what is that one? What do I call it again? The penultimate level, where it's just parts from the previous episodes. I can't remember what I called it. And then stuff like that, and and then it like by that point it was like everything had to be this big event. Every level had to be a big event. So as far as the personality part, that one I don't really know as much. I think that you do get a little bit of automatic personality if you're doing something and you can't do it perfectly, but you are trying to do it anyway. Like if you're someone like me, where you're not the best at level design and you're not the most experienced at level design, but you're trying to do these things like, giant tornado comes through and destroys a cathedral, or you're trying to do like big in episode 1, big chasm next to a rusting sawmill, even stuff like that. And with your skill set, you probably shouldn't be attempting something that big. You probably should be doing tiny little levels that you can perfect, but you're doing it anyway. And you end up getting some automatic like personality from that, because the stuff you're making ends up feeling a little bit more human and quirky. If that makes any sense, like seeing something that is obviously shooting for this goal and doing a good effort at trying to get to that goal, but not showing off, not obviously reaching the goal and just being like, look how cool look how skillful I am. That feels a lot more personable to people, I think. Stuff that's a little bit quirky, a little bit off kilter. I think that's one of the reasons that so many people have resonated with Cruelty Squad. Because Cruelty Squad is very much that, where it's very quirky and off kilter, and not in a sort of look how skilled I am at making a quirky off kilter meta game. It's that it feels like it's something from a human being, like it comes from someone with like a human with ideas, and not just from someone who is a perfect machine at making something.
So I guess continue with this line about kind of the environmental design. Oh, before we get to that, it's a quick time check. It's a little after 4:30. I know you said you have to go in about 30 minutes. So, for the chat, last call for questions will probably be in about 10 minutes. So if you do have any more questions for David, be sure to get them in the next few minutes. And I'll get to Will's question as well in a second as well. I think another aspect of this kind of like, having personality versus just making, these levels work is kind of like what we see with a lot more modern shooters with this more arena focus. I think this is something that really came into a head with Doom Eternal as well, that you're not, like, in between the actual fighting, you're just doing either platform, you're not really, like, fighting or engaging with the enemies. And then, of course, you get to the arena, it's all combat. And I felt like that was a real big difference from something like Quake. And even, like, again, going back to older ones like Doom and, of course, Dusk, that it's not just having enemies for these big moments. They'll be in the corridors, they'll be wandering around. And I don't know, I think for me, like, that feels more natural, that, like, you can fight them at any time. It's not just, we're saving them for the giant set pieces. I just wonder, like, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's been a difference for a while. That was actually one big thing that I wanted to do differently in Dusk, because there had been a few games that were, like, retro shooter, it's all retro, and they were just arenas. They were like, Serious Sam arenas, which I love Serious Sam, and I love Painkiller and games like that, but it's not quite the same thing. Ultimately, Dusk ended up kind of being a mid-ground, where there's a lot of exploring around and shooting guys in, hallways, but there are also distinct arenas you go into, because it turned out that fighting stuff in arenas in Dusk was actually really fun. So, yeah, I personally prefer it more like Quake. I like just exploring a level. I like the no distinction between exploring and looking around a level and fighting enemies. And it's just that you're going through this level and there are enemies blocking your path and you shoot them. I'd prefer that, but at the same time, that's not right for every game. Like, again, I'll go back to Serious Sam. Serious Sam does levels like that, and they're fun, but they're definitely not the best part of that game. I'm thinking specifically of the first encounter. Like, early levels in that basically play out like Quake levels, but they don't quite work as well as when it's just arenas. And more relevantly, I think, well, first of all, I think Doom Eternal did do a bit better job about that than 2016 did, because 2016 really did just turn into arena after a while. But even, Eternal is still very arena focused, which I think makes sense, because their entire combat system is designed as an arena combat system. It's not designed to work when you're just running through hallways. So, I don't fault any game for doing it that way, but it is also, it's not quite the same as what Quake and Doom did, and I personally prefer that style a little bit more.
Yeah. And to Will's question from earlier, how long did a level take on average for you? And did you work on a schedule, or as long as you were awake?
I basically burnt myself out on Dusk. I don't remember how long individual levels would take, but I was working on Dusk probably an average of 12 hours a day. Not every day. It was an average of that. And that was not healthy. I don't know if I could have done it any other way with the size that game was. But it certainly was something that I ended up paying for, and still am in some ways paying for now, because I worked for 3 years under. I hesitate to describe it as crunch because it wasn't mandated by anyone but myself, but it was basically self-mandated crunch, because I was just so driven to get this game done and out. So I wouldn't suggest that necessarily to anyone. I wouldn't, don't take that as this is how David made Dusk, so that's how I'm going to work. No, learn from my mistakes and take breaks and pace yourself, and don't burn yourself out, because burnout is not just unhealthy, mentally, but it's also unhealthy creatively. When you burn yourself out, you were not able to really work as much. You're not able to keep creating, and practically speaking, as an indie developer, you're not able to be making games that'll make you money.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my little spiel about Dusk Crunch.
And then we'll follow up. Did you have any strict working rules? No,
no, I didn't. I didn't need them. I've always been a bit of a workaholic. And so no, it was just I wanted Dusk done, even on days where I couldn't bear some days it was like I'm just so creatively driven to work on this game. I have to keep working on it. Other days, I couldn't bear the thought of even looking at it, but I wanted it done so bad.
Mm-hmm.
I was terrified it wasn't going to do well. I was terrified, I was going to have wasted all these years of my life. And if Dusk had not done well, I would have been done with games.
Mm-hmm.
There was, no way I could keep going after putting that much effort in and having something fail.
Mm-hmm.
So, I just wanted to rip that Band-Aid off and get it out. And, hopefully this game will make the kind of money that we think it's going to make. Hopefully, I almost worked like it was the last thing I was ever going to do. It was like I was just spending the rest of the energy that I had and all the ideas that I had, and I didn't plan on dying after Dusk was done, but I worked like I planned on dying after Dusk was done. And it turns out when you do that, and then Dusk is done, you feel like you're dead. Because, and you wake up after a few weeks of riding high on, Dusk releasing and doing well, and you realize the need to keep creating and keep working is still there, but you've just used up all your energy. So yeah, no rules. Didn't really need them. I watched YouTube videos while I worked sometimes. And yeah, I should have had rules of which I have now, which there are times when I am done with work, and times when I can work, and I don't work after I'm done with work. Unless it's on personal stuff, but I have days off. I didn't have days off while working on Dusk. Now I have days off to spend with my family and stuff like that.
Let's see. Both Try and Tomos asked, where was it? Anything you would change in Dusk, hindsight and all that?
Yeah, there would be no multiplayer. Also, the entire code base would be different. Let's see. It would not have Bloom. I mean, I tend to be very self-critical, so it's hard for me to look back on any project and not just see the number of things that I would do differently. But ultimately, if some weird combination of Doc Brown and Rick Sanchez showed up and burped at me and was like, I can take you back in time and you can change stuff about Dusk, I would not do that, because ultimately it was I wouldn't change how anything happened or what anything was, but it is hard not to think about if I just coded that differently, or if I'd made that thing animate better, stuff like that.
All right. And Juan asked, we already got the answer about the chance of a sequel happening, but any chance of Dusk DLC or an expansion?
Yeah, we've talked about it. Really, right now, both of those things are probably a ways off, just because of just practically speaking, how the timing is going to work with New Blood. We have to have X thing done before we can do this, and things like that. So I think it's something I'd like to do. The other problem is the further away I get from Dusk, the less confident I am in being able to do a good follow-up to it. Especially with now the number of other so-called boomer shooters coming out. The Dusk benefited immensely from when it came out, when it was there wasn't that many of these on the market, and it was one of the first ones. Some would say it's the one that jump-started it, which it could be. I'm not sure how well my levels would be received now when you're comparing them with, like the new Quake episode or things like that. But it's still something that would be cool to do, and Dave and I both have plans about what a DLC could look like. So yeah, probably in the future at some point.
Okay. Leandro asked, have you tested Dusk on development stage with other players, play testing, or something like that?
Yeah, a ton. Well, the way we released it was each episode was an early access, or each episode was a update to the early access release. The completed episode 1 was released, and then feedback we got from that could then be applied to episode 2, which we were currently working on. Early access was very beneficial for Dusk. I don't think it's always the right choice for a game, but in our case, like, we got so much player feedback on stuff we'd done. Previous to that, I'm trying to remember what we... Like, previous to releasing, I should say, I can't remember exactly what we tested, like, how we tested episode 1. I can't remember if we had the QA team at that point. It wasn't a massive, like, while developing episode 1, it wasn't like a massive amount of testing. But then the feedback then happened when we released episode 1, and we're able to get that, feedback going into episode 2, and then releasing episode 2 and get the feedback into episode 3, and that all of that was, a great help.
All right. Since we have about 15 minutes, I think this will be official last call, or we're at last call for questions from the chat. There are a few points a few last questions I want to get to with you tonight. And if you're free in the future, Dave, I'd love to have you back on, because there's still so much more we can talk about. Maggot asked, was the tornado in, I think that was in episode 3, was that inspired by Painkiller?
No. I do like Painkiller, though. I think, are you thinking of the Necrogiant fight, probably?
Maybe.
I do really like Painkiller, but no, the tornado was... I can't remember if there was any specific inspiration for it. I think it was just because I like tornadoes, and I always thought it would be cool to have, like... It's idea I've had for a long time. The original idea was that you would get picked up in the tornado and have to fight guys in the tornado. That just was not going to happen. The Dusk framework. So just having the tornado come through, I thought was cool enough.
Mm-hmm. So, before I get to this next very quick set of questions, one thing that I need to ask, I'm sure people who've played the game are wondering, why is soap, the Omni killer?
Another example of something where just micro decisions add up to a whole, I'm making a house. I think it was the pre-alpha house, which ended up going into level 6 in episode 1, I think. Level 7, one of those levels. So I was designing it, I was making a shower, and I'm like, well, a shower should have soap in it. So I made a soap prop, and I gave it bubbles. And one of my friends was like, that looks cool. It leaves bubbles in the air when you throw it. You should make it do something special. Me being me and having the sense of humor that I do, my version of something special was just to make this soap prop do something like 1 billion damage. I don't remember exactly. It's like 100, and I just hit the 0 key a whole bunch of times. It'll just kill everything in the game in a single hit. Figuring this will be a secret that somebody will find someday. Well, we ended up making it more obvious than that. Making it just sort of happened. It's like these little decisions, and then suddenly you end up with a meme bar of soap that can destroy everything. Even some stuff I didn't think of, like the cathedral. Speaking of the tornado, the cathedral in Blasphemy has a huge amount of health because it's a destructible object, so the tornado can destroy it. And And I didn't think of this, but speedrunners use the soap to destroy it, so they can get in there faster. And I'm like, oh, of course, that makes perfect sense. It's really stupid looking. They just throw the soap at the building, and a huge chunk just disappears.
Nice. Juan asked, did you play any games during the years of development or watch any movies?
Yeah, I did do that. We joke about Subnautica. Subnautica delayed Dusk because both Dave and I were playing Subnautica. Yeah, like I said, it wasn't literally 12 hours a day straight through for the entire 3 years. There was definitely some time where, I was playing games or watching. I remember. I don't remember everything I watched at that point, but I do remember watching specifically the Cabin in the Woods, because Dave was like, "This basically has Dusk's plot." So so yeah, did take some time off for that stuff.
All right. So, I guess for my final set of questions before we wrap things up for tonight, I want to get your thoughts kind of more on like the state of shooters today, more specifically the kind of retro shooter market. You used the term before I did, the quote-unquote boomer shooter. And I guess the first question for you and for the chat, what do you think when you hear the phrase boomer shooter? Because I feel old when I hear it.
Yeah, well, it comes from the 30-year-old boomer meme. It doesn't actually make that much sense because they're really like Gen X shooters.
Yeah.
But we've all kind of embraced it, so it's whatever. I mean, terms for things almost never make sense anyway. Yeah. So, but yeah, so I'm fine with it.
So, I guess with kind of, and you said this a few minutes ago, with kind of your debate about returning to Dusk, especially in today's market. I guess, what are your thoughts on kind of like how far we're really seeing kind of the quote-unquote retro shooter aspect go? Because this is something that I find very fascinating. Like, for me and for people watching, like, I'm more of a platformer guy, so my attention has been more focused on the evolution of 2D and 3D platformers. But the whole time that's been going on, especially like the last 5 years or so, there's definitely been a lot in terms of retro shooters, not just in terms of Dusk and Medieval, Graven, Gloomhaven, and even like more people doing stuff with, conversion mods for Doom and Quake. And it's very fascinating to me just to see like this side of like shooter development going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that it is a niche.
Yes.
Like boomer shooters are a niche. They are not a like Shovel Knight sort of zeitgeist. Dusk is frankly probably sales-wise the absolute top of that niche, which I'm very grateful for. But I don't see one of these games doing like Fortnite numbers, definitely, but Minecraft numbers, or going, even Five Nights at Freddy's numbers or anything like that. And there's nothing wrong with that, with it being a niche. I think that's exactly what it should be, like a comfy little niche of all of us who like these old games, make the old games, and buy each other's games, and buy games that look good, blah, blah, blah. But there is such thing as oversaturation, which I think we're about reaching at this point. And I'm sorry to say that. It sounds like pessimistic. It's not that I think there's going to be a crash or anything like that, but I think that we've definitely reached the point where there are more boomer shooter revivals out there than there is time and audience for playing all of them completely.
Yeah.
And I also think in some ways we're reaching saturation of like what you can really do with just a straight up Doom throwback or a straight up Quake throwback or whatever. Where we've seen now a lot of games doing that. And again, doesn't mean they should stop being made, but I think either the niche is gonna get a little more niche, because of that oversaturation and because of, people kind of getting tired of the same thing, or it's going to evolve a little bit and it's going to do the same thing that platformers and Metroidvanias did, and it's going to gain its own modern identity, which we are kind of seeing in small ways now.
Yeah.
And I know for my part, I don't want to be done making games like this. I don't think that I want Dusk to be the only sort of Quake and Doom style FPS I ever make. If it's the biggest one I ever make, that would be okay. I don't feel like I'm gonna be doing another one for a little bit, for a few years at least. But it's a genre that is very near and dear to me, and it's probably one that I'll want to come back to in some form. Whether that's just being inspired by it for another game or making another straight up throwback. And I think there are a lot of people like that, and there are a lot of players like that also. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to continue this revival in a way that is kind of beneficial to everybody. That we don't have a crash, and we don't have a lot of people starting to get angry and fed up with devs, with them, perceiving devs just being lazy and doing the same thing and all that. And we'll just see what happens.
Yeah, and I think I'm kind of with you on that line in terms of saturation. Like, again, like for people who've watched the streams, I've gone from playing Doom Eternal to Ultra Kill to playing Graven to then doing Quake to then doing Hadan, and you can, and I forgot Dread Templar in there as well. And
there's a lot of micro variety in there.
Yeah.
Even though they're in the same genre, all those games are kind of different, which is good.
Yeah, and like you said, like what we're feeling is that I think it's getting, like, because there's so many games out there, it's getting harder to impress somebody by just saying, my game is just like Doom, or my game is just like Quake. And again, like, Ultra Kill would also be a good example of this. Like, there is a huge difference between playing a game like Ultra Kill versus going back to playing something like Hadan, or I think I recently tried Project Warlock, and games that, they're not bad games by any stretch of the imagination, but you can tell, again, that difference between a game that is trying to hit that target and a game that's trying to go beyond that target and do something entirely different with it. And it gets harder, like, as development goes on, to keep going beyond that target.
Yeah. I think for me, the ones that resonate the most are... my favorite is Hrate. I think it's called Hrot. Which is basically a giant love letter to Chasm the Rift, so of course I like it. But the ones that resonate with me personally are the more quirky, weird ones. Not necessarily the most polished ones. But everyone's different. Like, there are some... given that I'm like a figure in this niche, which I don't deserve, but I really don't want to say anything negative about other boomer shooters, especially because there's a lot of them being made by guys who are just in the exact same position I was in making Dusk, that they're making this in their bedroom while working, another job, just because they love these sort of games. And the last thing I would want to do is to, be the person in a higher position of power and more success and be like stomping on them. That's, so I don't really talk a lot about, negative stuff about games, but there are definitely some ones, some out there that, like, I don't enjoy as much and some that I enjoy more. And I think probably a lot of fans are like that, where it's like there's some of the new ones that have come out that are more in the direction that you're looking for, and some that are more in a different direction. Like, one I guess I can talk about is Proteus, which is a game that I did really like and enjoy, but didn't really stick with me that much. Not because it's bad, but because its focus is much more on the sort of over-the-top, insane, explosive gunplay. and less on the atmosphere and the environments and stuff. It's not a weakness to the game, it's just a difference in focus. And I know some people are like, holy crap, this is one of the best ones. And because they want that really well executed high impact violence, essentially. And then for me, I'm like, one of my favorite ones is Harate. It's a Czech word, which less definitely less advanced on the whole like pyrotechnics front, but has a much more brooding atmosphere and weird, just weirdness going on, and that resonates more with me. So it's nice that there is this little variety in the niche genre. There's this variety of like what the games are doing, and a variety in visions of what like the essentials from the old games are. For some people, the essential is the combat, and making a game where you're fighting in a bunch of arenas is like very much in line because it has that speedy combat. And for other people, it's like the level design. For others, it's the visuals. We all value these different things.
Yep, and like we've said, like there is that very wide line, and especially wide line in terms of creativity that we're seeing from shooters. Like return to like the Doom Eternal example. Like there are people who want to play a shooter that is just turn off your brain, get into flow, and rip and tear. Then we have like the Doom Eternal Ultra Kill side where it's more tactical. It's more you're thinking about what you're doing, which is also very much in the complete opposite of what we see from like the multiplayer side of things in terms of like that kind of flow state. And like we don't have the time tonight to get into this, of course, because I could rant about this for like an hour. But like as like a quick end for this section, like it reminds you a lot of what I'm seeing from the Kaizo community in terms of platformers. Like there is a huge variety of them that they're experimenting with, but they're also coming from that same foundation of very precise, very difficult platforming that in of itself is a niche of a niche. So they have a lot of room to explore, but it's still kind of both limited and focused on that one specific audience.
And what's going to happen is in a few years, this exact same thing is going to happen with immersive sims. It's already starting to happen.
Yes.
We're gonna have a whole bunch of different indie immersive sims that all have a different idea of what that should look like.
Oh yes. So we are right at 5 o'clock. So wrap things up for tonight, for people watching, what are you currently working on? I know, of course, Gloomhaven. I'm sorry, and I'm really excited about that one. But anything else? Any other projects that you are currently a part of?
So let's see. Obviously that. I am working on Dusk 82, which is a little puzzle action demake of Dusk that is, well, a prequel to Dusk, actually. Not that there's going to be that much story, but it's a demake prequel to Dusk that will be on Switch and on PC pretty soon. And let's see, what else am I doing? A couple little things on the side, just on my own, that I haven't really announced. I guess there's freaking Rats for Breakfast, which I stupidly announced and put a Steam page up for, and then hit a design wall, and now can't figure out how to finish. Other than that, I'm actually at the point. I'm actually at a period right now where I'm trying to pare down the number of projects I'm working on, because I've actually worked on quite a few things since finishing Dusk, which maybe my releases don't really show. But, I've done a bunch of stuff with DreadX. I was working on unmentionable things at New Blood that didn't out. So yeah, right now I'm kind of trying to get stuff done and get to the point where I'm just working on Gloomwood as my day job, and then working on my own little hobby projects for fun, and not having to worry about much else. Of course, then what's going to happen is in a few months I'll suddenly decide I want to do Scroll Stapler 2 or something like that.
Yeah, and we unfortunately don't have the time to get into Squirrel Stapler tonight, but maybe we'll return to that one in the future.
Yeah, there's like what 8 other games we could have hour-long podcasts about. So.
Oh yes, and hopefully when I get to speak with Dave again, we'll see when his schedule's available. We'll be ranting and raving about more of those games as well.
Yeah, good luck getting a word in edgewise when interviewing him.
We did.
I talk a lot. Just wait.
All right. So to wrap things up for tonight, David, any social media, any place you like to plug, games, whatever, go for it.
Yeah. So I am on Twitter at @DuskDev. There's not a lot of development discussion going on now. Mostly it's just memes. And some of them are extremely cursed. In fact, most of them are cursed. So follow me if you like cursed memes, really bad takes that get turned into cursed memes, and just general shit posting that for some reason 50,000 people follow me for.
Yep, I follow both you and Dave, so it's a hilarity all around.
It's quite a timeline then. Then let's see. You can find a bunch of links to my stuff then on Twitter in a pinned post. I have a Steam creator page linked there, which you can follow if you want to see whenever more games of mine come out. I have some music because I do music because I have a degree in music, and I should actually use that since I paid thousands for it. Again, linked on Twitter. Let's see. Follow all the New Blood stuff, of course. Again, linked on Twitter. Just go to my Twitter, you'll find all the links there, essentially.
All right. So, my final question for you, David, to wrap things up, because I know we have a lot of fans watching this live or recorded. Do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans to end this cast on?
Oh, gosh, you're putting me on the spot. Doom 3 Shotgun.
All right. So, with that said, we're going to wrap things up for our cast this week. David, again, thank you so much for coming on. And like I said, if you are free in the future, I would love to have you back on. There's still so much more we can certainly get into here.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right. And for those of you watching this live or recorded, thank you for tuning in. If you are new, do the liking, subscribing, all that social media stuff. We have our Discord open to everyone in the description down below. If you are a developer working on a game, whether it's shooter, boomer shooter, or whatever, and would like to come on and talk about it, I am always looking for guests, so feel free to reach out. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, worries in the art and science of games. And I almost forgot, plug my books. I'm like Dave talking about, We Hate Money. I forgot to plug. I have books that I've written. You'll find those links down below, the Game Design Deep Dive series. So, with that said, everyone, come back for daily discussions. Have a great rest of your night, and we will see you next time. Take care.